Welcome again. Thank you for tuning in. This is Mideast Realities, our weekly program about what is really happening in the Middle East today and what's happening in the United States about what's happening in the Middle East. My name is Mark Bruzonsky. I'm the host of this program, and we're in downtown Washington today. We're on K and 16th, in fact, in the heart of downtown Washington, and we're at the offices of an organization that goes by the name the Council on the National Interest. This is a group that was set up, I believe, about 5 years ago. Gene Bird, who's sitting next to me, is currently the president of this organization. He's a former Foreign Service officer who a number of years took over this group. And we're going to talk today about U.S. policy toward the Middle East, the realities of that policy, why the United States pursues certain economic, military, and aid policies, primarily to the State of Israel, and how this particular organization has set its cause as changing that relationship between the U.S. and Israel. So without further ado, Gene Bird, thank you for coming on our program.
Thank you, Mark, for inviting me.
All right.
I think the Council for the National Interest, it's not on the national interest, for the national interest, was started 5 years ago by Congressman Paul Findley, who had been defeated in a rather nasty election out in Illinois in the early 80s, and he wrote a book, They Dare to Speak Out, which I know you're familiar with. He's written another book since then called Dangerous Deceptions. Both books are concerned with the relationship between Israel and the United States. The 6,500 members we have across the country, 21 chapters, are dedicated to finding a new and more normal relationship, a less passionate attachment between Israel and the United States, both on behalf of a long-term introduction of the United States to a new policy towards the Middle East that is balanced and fair, and also in terms of finding a way for Israel to have a relationship with her Arabs, the Israeli Arabs who are citizens of Israel, and with her neighbors. Everyone agrees that peace is a good thing in the Middle East. It's good for the United States, but it's also very good for Israel.
Well, but Gene, the question is what kind of peace? Now, what kind of peace does the Council for the National Interest want to see? Are we talking about different regimes in different countries?
No, we're talking about the nub of the problem. The key to the problem is the relationship between Israel as a national Jewish state, not a Jewish state, but a national Jewish state that has 20% of her population are Arabs, and her relations with the Palestinians.
You want to see a Palestinian state?
I want to see a Palestinian state because obviously the Palestinians are very talented, and 6 million of them, most of them in the diaspora. They've been forced out of their normal land. And I think the only thing that will lead to peace in the Middle East is to start with the Palestinian desire for statehood, for independence, for self-determination, and move as rapidly as possible in that direction.
Your thesis is that the primary problem in the Middle East is, in fact, the Israeli-Palestinian connection, American aid to Israel, which makes it possible for the Israelis to conduct themselves in the way they do. But you when you talk about a Palestinian state, it struck me, as I read over the material from your organization, that your most major report, issued in the last few months, I think, outlining a trip that a number of you took and outlining your prescription for what U.S. policy should be, nowhere is a Palestinian state, in fact, mentioned in this document. It gives the impression that you're very happy with the Clinton administration's approach, with the peace process, with the Gaza-Jericho deal, with the what some of us think of as reservation status that the Palestinians have been subjected to. And I was quite startled, frankly, that this entire document doesn't even talk about pushing for Palestinian statehood.
But it does talk about Palestinian self-determination. What we were dealing with there was an attempt to look at and monitor the present peace process. Mark, it was a limited attempt in terms of the 23 or 24 people, many of them from peace organizations across the country, some from Harvard, and we wanted to look at how it was being carried out. We didn't look at final status, although we certainly felt with regard to Jerusalem, we made a very strong recommendation that Jerusalem must have in its eastern part a capital for the Palestinians. Well, that was specified in there. It was specified exactly how that could be done.
Yes, in fact, I have the quote here. But this program, Mideast Realities, is dedicated to one proposition, and that is that the real realities of the situation are not being forthrightly discussed either by the governments in the region or by the United States government, or by many of the groups that are involved in one way or another in Middle East affairs. And the impression I got from the report was that this report would go over very well in Amman, Jordan, with the Hashemite regime, or in Saudi Arabia with the Saudi regime, or frankly, for that matter, in Israel, which is very much desirous of seeing this peace process continue. In fact, you know, they used to want us to call it Judea and Samaria, and some of us insisted on calling it the West Bank. And they want us to call what's happening the peace process, and they've succeeded pretty well. But in many people's minds, it's not a peace process at all. It's a continuation of policies that the United States and Israel have pursued for a very long time.
I have no argument with that at all. The occupation is continuing. We make that statement in there, as a matter of fact. The occupation by Israel is continuing, and as long as the Israelis, particularly the IDF and particularly the border forces, are in charge of the lives of the young Palestinians, there's going to be trouble. And this is a basic problem in the whole peace process.
Well, maybe
we told Perez that there was that the IDF essentially was out of control.
But he knows that. And well, Rabin is the IDF.
He said in response to that, it was quite interesting, he said, well, you know, it's just lower level commanders. And we said, but yes, but
now, come on,
you have...
This is the good guy, bad guy.
Yeah,
this is the good... Yitzhak's the bad guy, and Shimon's the good guy. The reality, of course, is that it's the Israeli Labor Party which has pursued these policies for 40 years. They've been in collusion with the Hashemites to put down the Palestinians.
They started the settlements.
They started the settlements, they created the Gaza ghetto, and now they come forward and Shimon says all these nice things, but the reality is that the Palestinian cause has been pushed under while the occupation has been continued, and while 73% of the occupied territories that the UN has demanded repeatedly be considered occupied territories are under Israeli control. So it leads me to ask you, you write a report which says the U.S. has adopted an ambiguous and inadequate policy on final status for Jerusalem, seeming to avoid the key issues. Well, the moment I read that, I said to myself, CNI has adopted an ambiguous and an inadequate policy on final status concerning the Israeli-Palestinian situation.
We'll never agree, because we're in the business, I suppose, of politics in terms of where the power lies here in America and in Israel. And you know that the basis of American policy at this point towards Israel and towards the Arab states is controlled by a very small group of people here in the United States. And
who are these people?
Well, these people include, of course, the present group of advisors in the White House and on the Hill. They include a large number of pro-Israeli forces, over 1,000 tax-deductible organizations that contribute to Israel and are very much involved in all of these decisions.
But this is true during the Reagan period and during the Bush period as well.
But it's become monumentally more effective in the Clinton administration than before. And the Clinton administration was totally surprised by the decision of Rabin to recognize the PLO.
Well, I'm really amazed that you say that, because I've been involved in these affairs for a long time, and I know all of the Israeli officials, and they've been talking about doing this kind of thing since the 70s. They just didn't have anyone who was ready. The biggest change that came was that Yasser Arafat said, I'm willing to do this, after he had ordered PLO officials for the last generation never to do what, in fact, he then did.
He then did.
So the fact that you say the Clinton people were surprised, I think it's sort of politic to give the impression that there was this huge breakthrough between Israel and the Palestinians. The reality is Yasser Arafat surrendered. And anytime you're prepared to surrender, your enemy is prepared to maybe be a little bit...
You can look at it that way, but Mark, let's just suppose that we had Arafat continuing to be in Tunis, continuing to try to create a military solution. Essentially what happened was that both sides, including the Israelis, as far as the as far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is concerned, both sides are now aware that there is no military solution. Before, I think the Israelis...
Well, if they're aware of that, there's sure an awful lot of arming going on in the Middle East these days. In fact, more arms are going into the Middle East right now than were going in before this so-called peace process in Madrid started.
Well, one of the surprises out of the peace process to me was the fact that the Israelis were so unable to control their own arms merchants within Palestine. They are the ones who are selling all these arms that get into the hands of Hamas. I wouldn't be at all surprised that the material for the bomb that went off in Tel Aviv actually came from Israeli stores.
And the training apparently took place in southern Lebanon during the year of expulsion of these people.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, that's another tale. The Israelis in the early 80s, given the nod by Haig, General Haig, the chief of staff at the time,
Secretary of State, I hope, at the time.
Secretary of State at the time, excuse me. He gave them the nod and let them go into Lebanon, and it was an absolute disaster for the Israelis, except that they eliminated the PLO armed forces, they thought, in Lebanon. Instead, they got the Hezbollah. They created the conditions out of which the Hezbollah came to power.
Let's talk about Hamas and Hezbollah. You're giving the impression that the Israelis are somehow terribly worried about these people and really concerned about them. My own reading of the situation is that the Israelis, of course, they don't want to see Jews killed, and it causes them all kinds of political problems in terms of the upcoming Israeli election. But that they love the idea that Palestinians are killing Palestinians. They love the idea that there's a low-grade civil war taking place. They love the idea that they've destroyed the PLO, they've turned Yasser Arafat into their own puppet, and they've taken the edge off of the cause. The whole world was talking about the Palestinian cause a few years ago. Now, the Palestinians are treated worse than ever. The occupation is as much in control as ever. The Palestinians are locked up in Gaza tighter than they were locked up before. The Israelis are even bringing in foreign workers from Asia and other places, while the Palestinians stew in Gaza, 60% unemployed.
They were doing that before.
More and more they're doing that.
But they're doing it more and more.
And under these...
That, incidentally, is at the expense of the United States. Those workers, in a sense, because $1 out of every $6 spent by the government of Israel comes out of the pockets of the federal government here in the United States.
Yeah, but comes back to the federal government. We give them money, they pay us for the aid we gave them before. Well, we give them money for military goods, they buy military goods from us, and then the Arabs have to buy for cold cash 5 times more than we give the Israelis.
Absolutely.
So some people like Noam Chomsky...
This argument of it flowing back is nonsense, because we're still giving them the money. We're still giving them the goods, which could go into other and more viable...
And in return, the Israelis police the Middle East for us. It's a pretty good deal.
Well,
if you're an American imperialist.
you know, that was one of the interesting things that Perry said, Defense Secretary Perry, on the Hill the other day. He was asked, well, are there anybody, is there any other country besides the United States that is carrying out a policy of containment of Iran and Iraq? And he fumbled around for a bit, and he finally said, well, of course, Israel is there. He never once mentioned Syria, which has, you know, a very large army poised, in a sense, to confront Iraq, because that's her natural enemy, as natural an enemy as Israel.
Actually, you could look at it another way, and you could say that Syria and Iraq are natural allies. But that's beyond the parameters.
Not in the Israeli strategic equation at all.
That's beyond the parameters today, because that'll take us off in tangents, and we've only got a short time. But let's talk about the organization that you head up, its reasons for being, and what it's doing. In something that you've written that was sent to me, this is from September, October '94, publication that you write for, you described the Council for the National Interest as a group dedicated to supporting a land for peace settlement. Well, if so, that's the policy of the government of the United States.
Hardly. Look at the East Jerusalem, for example. Look at what was done concerning the withdrawal of the Israeli defense forces from the occupied areas, populated occupied areas, the other day. Christopher went right along with Rabin's statement that it was going to be impossible because to carry out this part of the agreement. I don't think that we have a policy of. We certainly don't have a Palestinian statehood policy. Officially.
We certainly don't, and as I already pointed out in your recent report, you don't either.
Oh no, that's not true. We do. It's in our mission statement. It's a part of our working towards self-determination and statehood.
Well, it's not being pushed very forcefully then.
Well, the first thing to remember about CNI is that we are concerned about U.S. national interests, not about necessarily Palestinian, there are a lot of organizations, or Israel, or any other part of the Middle East. We want a viable, common sense policy towards the Middle East. We have interests.
Okay.
We have very important interests out there that are being ignored.
When there was a military takeover in Algeria, and the democratic forces that were about to be swept into power through the democratic ballot box were repressed, 30,000 of them now being held in prisons and tortured, Egypt has terribly repressive policies. All kinds of human rights organizations have condemned the Egyptian government for its torture and repression. Saudi Arabia, we all know it's a police state and a state that gets tremendous amounts
I don't agree with you on that at all. I don't think Saudi Arabia is a police state.
Saudi Arabia is not a police state?
No, I don't think so.
With completely arbitrary policies in terms of human rights and in terms of who's put in jail?
Actually, there are very few people in jail in Saudi Arabia.
Just in the last few months, hundreds of intellectuals and clergy have been arrested for doing no more than speaking up in the mosques.
Listen, let's talk about Israel and the Palestinians.
Well, but wait a minute.
One out of every 4 men between the ages of 15 and 40 have served time in Israeli jails.
Absolutely.
And there have been 120,000 put in jail out of a population of about less than 2 million.
No argument with you. Israeli policies have been terribly repressive, and American support for those policies. But wait a minute.
I'm not looking at repressive policies of other regimes as much as I am looking at the most inflammatory part of the Middle East, which is the relationship between Israel and her Palestinians under occupation. That must end. That is the beginning point for a lot of things that could happen.
But why is it so difficult? Why is it so difficult for the Council for the National Interest to take positions and policies on major developments taking place in other countries? The impression that's given, I have no idea exactly where your budget comes from and who's funding it and that kind of thing. I do know how the organization was started, and I know that was done with money from Saudi Arabia. But that's 5 years ago.
No, that's not true. The money that came from Saudi Arabia was contributed by private businessmen, and it was not a
the brother of King Fahd?
It was not a significant part of the the amount of money that was generated even in the early years. And now it's
the entire bill for the organizing meeting in Orlando, Florida, wasn't paid for by the brother of the King of Saudi Arabia?
Yes, there was but that was not a very important meeting in terms of you know how we got started was because Paul's book, which has sold 125,000 copies.
Well, not sold. An awful lot of those were given away, but
no,
that's how many are in print.
That's not true. Most all of those were sold.
Well, I in fact endorsed Paul's first book.
Quite well. And it was people who read that book and said, Paul, why don't you form an organization that does something about this special relationship between Israel and the United States? That is what we're concerned about. But we're not concerned about all of the other problems in the Middle East. We're not going to solve all of them.
Then it would have been more fair to say Council on U.S.-Israel Relations, rather than, you just a few minutes ago were saying, we're concerned about the national interests of the United States in the Middle East. You're really concerned with the U.S.-Israel connection, and the name is a bit misleading. Of course, there are a lot of organizations in Washington with misleading names.
Well, that's possibly true that sometimes they're misleading, but let me tell you that several of my friends around town have said, I wish I had invented that name, the Council for the National Interest.
Well, because it's very useful, because Americans are national interests. Let's pursue our national interests.
We're imitating the National PAC, which is, of course, a pro-Jewish, pro-Israeli PAC, the most important pro-Israeli PAC. So national interest does have a flavor, but we are interested in the national interest as a whole in the Middle East.
But why is
national interest? We're not looking at changing every government. We don't even look at changing the Israeli government. We think we should get out of the business of changing and modifying governments.
But the United States, the CIA, the American military keep most of the governments in the region in power. If you want to get out of that business, you're going to have to change the entire relationship between the U.S. government and the Middle East.
I don't agree with you on that. I think CIA, I'm a Foreign Service officer, and we don't have a very friendly relationship with the CIA.
But you don't any longer, since you're no longer, you no longer have to answer to them. You don't have to answer these questions as if you're still a Foreign Service officer.
Look, what I really would like to talk about this afternoon for a couple of minutes is how we're going to get to a more normal relationship with Israel. That's the beginning point.
What is CNI going to do about that?
Well, this last spring we worked on a bill called the Penny Bill, which would reduce aid to Israel and Egypt by 5% and convert it to regional aid. It got nowhere on the Hill, but
just
it started...
5%?
Yeah, just 5%.
I mean, pretty
small. But it would have generated, over a period of 3 or 4 years, really more money than we're going to be giving to regional aid from the United States. This is aid to go to Jordan and Lebanon and Syria and possibly Egypt and Israel, all of those countries, and the Palestinians, of course. So we think that this next time around, with this new Congress, we're going to try and introduce a more comprehensive bill. We're going to try and get someone to introduce a bill which will probably lead to a very substantial regional development organization which will ease the peace process for Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and the Palestinians, because money is the milk of politics abroad, just as it is here. And we have to recognize
money
that.
And under-the-table support.
Our problem with the Israeli aid package is that it is going for building settlements. Look at all those settlements.
Well, not anymore.
Oh, yes.
It did build these settlements.
Oh, no, but it's going right now. Look at the day before yesterday. We were told that Jerusalem is going to be surrounded with settlements.
It is surrounded by settlements.
Well, there's going to be more massive
This is the proverbial, the horse is already out of the barn.
Yeah, you're right. Exactly right.
So closing the door...
This should have happened 10 years ago.
Closing the door now isn't going to put the horse back in.
I was told that, this massive aid program to Israel started with the unreal feeling after Camp David that, oh my God, Israel has made peace with Egypt, and Egypt has made peace with Israel. Let's give them some money. And
well, they were rewarded. They were bribed. It depends on how you want to look at it.
Yes, but the problem was there wasn't a sunset law on the bribery. It goes on and on and on.
Well,
we had
because
Shlomo Gazit. We had the general who was in charge of the occupation here at our conference in September. I debated him on this whole subject. And at one point, someone from the audience yelled at him and said, well, if we can't end aid now, because he said we needed aid for the Golan, we needed aid for moving the settlers out of the West Bank, and we can't end aid now. Someone said, well, when can you? And he thought for a moment, and he said, when Israel is at full peace for 5 years with Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran.
Nobody.
And the guy in the audience yelled at him, well, that means never.
Nobody gives up what they've already got. But on the other hand, let's get back to CNI.
There's a lot of people on the Hill who are still in the closet on this. Essentially, CNI is an attempt to get the subject out on the table, essentially to get a debate started, just like between you and I.
All right.
And